I'm Rob Dietz.
I'm Jason Bradford.
And I'm Asher Miller. Welcome to Crazy Town, where we'd rather get choked out by a UFC fighter on the White House lawn than think about the state of our oceans.
It'd be easy, with the cluster frick of crazy-making economic, geopolitical, and democracy in decline news dominating the scene, to forget that the unraveling of environmental systems waits for no person. That's why we've asked Emily Schoerning to return to Crazy Town. Asher and Emily sit down together, virtually, to discuss the oceanic dynamics, from worrisome to downright apocalyptic, that could make the Strait of Hormuz disruption look like a 5-minute wait at the Starbucks drive-thru.
Hey, Rob and Jason. It's nice to see you guys. Though I gotta say, I'm glad that we're not actually physically in the same room together. You know, we're doing this virtually.
Why?
Because my head might explode. And that would be messy if my head explodes and then somebody's got to wipe off like my monitor or whatever. But like,
Right.
I don't think your wife would like that, Jason. Like, get all over the yoga mat and stuff, you know?
Exactly.
I've got a waterproof jacket, so I can be like one of those people who watches the Shamu show at SeaWorld.
And here's why. I wanted to get together because this whole fucking UFC fight on the lawn of the White House, like...
You have issues.
I feel like, you know, we were in idiocracy before and somehow we've lapped it. We've gone past idiocracy into some other world. I'm not sure what it is. It's even dumber than idiocracy was. And I'm struggling with that a bit, gotta say.
I don't see how you could possibly be struggling with lawn fighting at the White House. I mean, what better use of governmental acreage could you come up with?
It's an octagon. It's not a lawn. It's an octagon.
Right.
Can we put like Trump and Putin inside the octagon for one of the fights?
Well, there was a conversation. I think Zuckerberg and Elon Musk were gonna have it out at one point. I think we should get all the tech bros doing this. That should be the only fight that we would permit on the lawn of the White House. They own the place anyway, right?
Like one of those old Royal Rumbles. You put them all in the cage at once
exactly.
and see who's left.
Exactly. But the reason I'm losing my mind about this, well, one of the many reasons I'm losing my mind about this, is there's some like serious shit going on in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just talk about what's actually happening in the oceans right now. And it feels like all of our attention is going to these stupid distractions. Some of them are very serious things that are happening, right, in the world.
Right.
But things like this, capturing our attention is just like masking what is really happening out there that we should be worried about or paying attention to. And we're just not because of this stupid crap.
But we barely paid attention to this stuff when there wasn't this complete political madness going on. Right? I mean, it was always page 10, almost always page 10 anyway. But like, you're right. Now it's just swamped. And I feel bad because like the oceans have given us grace. Like the oceans have given us some time.
We came from the oceans.
We slithered out from the oceans. Yeah. I mean, but they gave us time. They like absorbed all this early heat.
Oh, with climate change, yeah.
Yeah. They've been this wonderful buffer. And now I think you're right. I think that era where the oceans are this like, thankfully they're taking the hit for us. I think that's over.
Well, you guys are lamenting that we're distracted by all this stuff and we're not paying attention to the oceans. I'm thinking a lot about the oceans. In fact, not only are they building that octagon at the White House lawn, but they're redoing the whole reflecting pool. We could make that a wave pool with surfing.
Oh, good idea.
Yeah.
And then I could be doing that rather than sitting here podcasting and lamenting about ocean circulation shutdowns and buffers and grace periods.
Oh my gosh, the whole mall could be like an amusement park.
Right.
Okay. I
Great
think you're
idea.
absolutely right. I was in Budapest, Hungary, and this city park in the middle of the city had a wave pool. That's what DC's missing.
This is the sequel. It's Mall of America Part 2.
And the Washington Monument, you kind of get a zip line from the top all the way to the Lincoln Memorial. You could zip line that baby.
And you just crash into one of those columns at the bottom of the zip line. It'll be awesome.
Oh, my God. Oh, the Vietnam Memorial skate park, right? Okay. I mean, it'd be perfect. Oh, Rob.
You jest, but just you wait, right? I mean, we're not far from that. But bring back to the oceans, you know.
I feel better now. Oh, don't be a downer.
Bern in Switzerland, which I think is the capital of Switzerland. They have these bears that it's named after bears, and they have these bears that they're basically like in the center of town. You know, like this outdoor exhibit or whatever with these bears. So since the oceans are becoming basically, too warm, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we need to just create like a huge outdoor exhibit of like sea life, and we could just put those on display at the mall in the capital as well, right?
We could have it as one of those river rides where you get in like a big circular kind of floaty and you can have a whole party on it, like 8 people, and it kind of goes down and along the mall, and then every once in a while a shark comes up and just...
Well, they have those like beer... Have you seen those things where people are peddling and they're drinking beer together? It's like they're sitting at a bar and they've got like pedals. So you could do that too. You could be drinking to your heart's delight and you're peddling basically down the lazy river at the mall, with,
and then a giant squid tentacle just goes, just yanks you out.
So I think, Asher, you actually talked to somebody who has something intelligent to say rather than us planning the next iteration of DC.
I think that Emily, so we're talking about Emily Schoerning, who's a great climate communicator. She runs an organization called American Resiliency. We've actually had her on the podcast before. And it's true. I wanted to sit down and have a real like adult conversation with her about what's actually happening in the oceans.
Yeah, not with
I'm
us.
sure she'll really appreciate the way that we set this up for her, because there's no greater transition, than us talking about having an amusement park, at the Mall of America now is at the Mall of DC.
Part 2. It's a sequel.
Part 2. Yeah. Let's take it from there. Here comes Emily. All right, Emily, it is so nice to see you again. Thanks for coming back on A Crazy Town. I know that I am not as handsome as Jason, but at least I won't bore you with talk about birds and geeking out about biology, although maybe you prefer that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm like feeling a sense of outrage at the fact that we're not going to talk about birds, but I'll be able to handle it. I'll be okay.
I appreciate that because I could just spot colors. Basically, I'm below novice in the birding world. Well, I wanted to bring you back on the podcast because to me, in the midst of all the craziness that's happening in the world between the war in Iran and the energy crisis and rising costs and politics and AI running roughshod over everyone, I don't feel like a lot attention is being paid right now to the climate crisis. And I wanted to actually, because there's so much that's happening in that space, and you are one of the go-to climate communicators I can think of out there, wanted to kind of cover that ground with you a little bit, but maybe keep it slightly more narrow because there's a lot we could talk about. And maybe we'll just focus on what's happening in the oceans, if that's okay. And so I want to talk about 2 dynamics. One is developing more slowly, but could be completely world-changing, and the other is like right at our doorstep. So let's start with the nearer-term one, which is this possibility that we might enter into a Super El Niño. And maybe just to begin, for those who are not super well-versed, maybe you just explain what an El Niño is for folks.
It is sort of difficult, right? The El Niño, La Niña, and neutral cycles.
Yes.
Because these are global patterns, global weather patterns that can have unpredictable impacts from year to year. When we're talking about moving into a El Nino, which it's timely, we're recording on May 26th, and we just got an ENSO update today. We're talking about a pattern that is fundamentally caused by warmer than usual sea surface temperatures. So in an El Nino cycle, we get this warm water moving into the atmosphere, changing global weather patterns. La Nina is sort of the cool associated cycle where we're not having as much heat moving out of the oceans. And I really like your idea of focusing on oceans as we take a moment and look at where we are in climate, because changes in ocean behavior are really the place to watch as we want to predict what's going to happen in the next 5 years, next 10 years.
So, yeah, maybe talk about what is happening in the Pacific right now and El Ninos, like you were just saying, we've got these patterns, right, of these things happening. So El Ninos are not particularly rare, but what's happening right now in the Pacific, why are people talking about the possibility of a super El Nino or more extreme version of that?
So sea surface temperatures are really high right now. We've tipped back to all-time highs a couple of times here in 2026. We're moving into an El Nino, very likely moving into an El Nino in the next couple of months. And it's not just that we're talking about these extremely high temperatures emerging in the Pacific, as you alluded to. I think it's worth noting that the world temperatures, the world daily sea surface temperature average is also high.
Yeah.
So, of course, it's correct that people are concerned about these extreme high temperatures in the Pacific. There's concerns we're going to have another the blob style heat wave that will be devastating to marine ecosystems off the West Coast. But that heat is in the context of global heat.
Yeah. It's not just happening in that one zone. And what are some of the predictions or concerns that we're hearing? If this El Nino comes to pass, it turns into a super El Nino, what are some of the predictions and concerns? And also maybe you just talk a little bit about disclaimers or caveats, because I know that it's not a certainty. It seems like high probability, at least from what I'm hearing, but maybe talk a little bit about kind of where the certainty is right now.
So this is the new official NOAA ENSO update, where we're not in El Nino right now, right? I think it's very important to ground ourselves in the fact that this hasn't happened yet. But May, June, July, we're looking at a greater than 80% chance, according to the official NOAA ENSO update. And we're looking at high 90% chance of being in El Nino as we move towards the end of summer. It's always nice to look at multiple sources for these sorts of predictions. I think that the Columbia Climate School always is an interesting place to also check. They're saying that we're at a 98% chance of entering El Nino in May, June. So we're talking about something that hasn't happened yet. El Nino hasn't been declared yet, but it really looks like it's coming. And that's a separate question from this question of, is it going to be a super El Nino or not?
Sure. Yeah.
When we were looking at entering the 23-24 El Nino, which I think is very relevant for any people who are watching the climate data come in, right? The 23-24 El Nino season, everyone was very concerned because sea surface temperatures globally were also behaving very strangely. There's one thing that is different as we're coming in to this potential El Nino system, and that is that Antarctic sea ice is not behaving as abnormally. 2023 was a record low year for Antarctic sea ice, and that we're not seeing the same level of anomalous behavior in 2026 with Antarctic sea ice as we did in 2023. So
that's better news. Is that fair to say it's better news?
I'm not trying to be like, oh, this sandwich is fine because it only has 12 bugs on it. And our last sandwich had 15 bugs on it, right?
Right. Yeah.
But we are looking at somewhat more normal behavior in some other Earth systems. Helps me kind of like stay on the ledge around how intense is this El Nino going to be. It makes me not really want to speculate too much on if we're going to have this super El Nino or not, like an 1877 style super El Nino. That's
Right.
definitely possible. A lot of people were very concerned that we were going into an 1877 style El Nino in 23, 24. They were concerned it was going to be a 2-year El Nino, but
Mhm.
it ended up being relatively short. We transitioned to La Nina pretty hard and fast.
Mhm. Now, you say 1877. What was that? What was that like? Why are people worried about it being like that year?
So you can imagine that we don't have the same quality of Earth systems information from 1877 that we do now. But people were observing these El Nino, La Nina cycles way back in history. If we look at pre-Columbian history, there's awareness in South America and Central America, where we see such profound impacts of these cycles going back thousands of years.
Mhm.
1877 was an observed El Nino, and it drove serious crop failure across the world. Some estimates that it may have killed by famine 3% of the world's population at that time. So this is millions of people. And you can imagine that anyone who follows supply chain and ag industry news right now is not happy about the possibility of an El Nino further whacking these systems, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we're
So
talking about what's the shocks that are happening because of fertilizer shortages, the blockage basically of oil and natural gas and other products moving through the Strait of Hormuz, just triggering a bunch of stuff in the energy sector and the economy.
yes, and that fertilizer impacts of the Hormuz closure, we're talking about a third of the world's fertilizer supply that did not make it into the hands of farmers worldwide. When we look at potential impacts in the US, I think that many of us in the US, we have a tendency to center the tragedy in ourselves, right? When we look at who is more likely to actually face food shortages this year, most of what I'm reading suggests poorer parts of Europe and poorer parts of Southeast Asia are where we're
Yeah.
looking at really serious food shortages this year, not the US.
Yep. And that, again, if we see impacts of an El Nino, maybe talk about that. So we don't have to catastrophize and say it's going to be 1877, but in a typical El Nino or what we experienced in 23, 24, what kinds of impacts are we seeing around the globe as a result of that?
You see, this is really interesting because I think we have to separate out a little bit typical El Nino impacts and what happened in 23, 24.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Everything has been coming so fast and furious. I think that many of us have not really had time to postmortem the 23, 24 El Nino. We were just glad we got out of that,
Yeah.
right? So a typical El Nino, you're going to see impact to the monsoon cycle. You can get some challenges with monsoon cycle timing in Southeast Asia, meaning that where we were already seeing supply chain impacts for Southeast Asia, and fertilizer impacts to Southeast Asia, we may see more heat, we may see delay of the monsoon, and any additional heat waves across Asia, they're already dealing with
Yeah, it's
such
devastating.
intense heat. I'm sure you've
Yeah.
seen how intense the heat has been in India already this year. If we take it home, if we look at the US, often in an El Nino year, you see more moisture to the southwest, which, if we think about that as a potential impact, I think that many of us with our eyes on the southwest are like, that would be okay.
Mm-hmm.
That would be good. To the Pacific Northwest, we see more heat, maybe a little bit drier, which the drought is already substantial in much of the Northwest, so that's concerning. And typically, we see less hurricane formation in the Gulf in an El Nino year. I've had a number of AR community members in Florida be like, yeah, we're going for 2, because last year was a very uninteresting year in terms of Florida impacts from Gulf storms.
Yeah.
But here's where I want to look a little bit at the 23-24 El Nino as an unusual El Nino, acknowledged by the climate community as, in some ways, unpredictable El Nino. It turned off faster than projected. The shift to La Nina was faster than projected. And 23 and 24 were 2 unusually active hurricane years where we saw a lot of severe hurricanes including Idalia, Milton, and Helene, follow unusual inland tracks, causing devastation in many communities across the Southeast. I mean, anyone who has forgotten what Helene did across the Carolinas, across Georgia, we need to be aware that these more inland hurricane tracks are part of the projections for how hurricanes will move differently in our warming world. So when we consider what are the at-home impacts of this potential El Nino system, unfortunately, this is another place where we have to embrace uncertainty because El Ninos are maybe not behaving in the same ways they used to.
Yeah. What typically happens after an El Nino? And I know you just said we can't bank on, these patterns from the past occurring again, but do things just snap back? You said the 2023, 2024 kind of ended really quickly, moved into La Nina. Like, what happens with sea temperatures? I mean, do they return back to quote unquote a normal level? Are things just continuing to elevate? And so we come to sort of like a new normal and that becomes a new baseline?
I think that this is another then and now question.
Mm-hmm.
El Niños and La Nina, this cycle always has a lot of variation. Usually you get some return to neutral, to ENSO neutral, where the sea surface temperature in that relevant area in the Pacific is neither anomalously high nor anomalously low. We're just hanging out. We're having a normal year, not a La Nina year, not an El Nino year. When we look at the 23-24 El Nino, and when we look at the substantial El Nino that peaked in 2016, and we look at global air surface temperatures, we don't see a return to normal. People are talking about this more with the 23-24 El Nino, where we moved from about 1.2 C over pre-industrial baseline up to near 1.5 C over pre-industrial baseline. 0.3 degrees in a year. And then we haven't really gone back down. That's not good. When you look at the data graphically year by year, you see a similar rise and failure to return to baseline on the global level with the 2016 El Nino. And I think that for anyone who is concerned about this potential for rapid warming, temperature increase that's going to go outside of models, this sort of El Nino step-up pattern is really disturbing. It's a concern to see. And I feel like it's worth picking out those impacts from 2016 and from 23-24 as we look at what could happen with this El Nino, Super El Nino or not. If we pick another 0.2 degrees up, which, Hansen has been quoted as saying he thinks this could push global averages to 1 point, or if we picked up another 0.3, like we happened with the non-Super El Nino that we had from 23-24, that puts us to 1.8.
And just to remind, viewers and listeners, the global community set 1.5 as kind of the target for warming, right? That was the Paris Accords.
Yeah, that's where we wanted to limit the impacts of warming.
So we've already basically there, and now we're talking about shooting past that potentially much more quickly, as far as I understand, than would have been modeled previously.
Yeah, I often have people who tell me that when they think about what they were taught to expect with global warming, they're like, it's happening now. I'm seeing it now.
Yeah.
For most of us who were given an education as to projected impacts, they were the impacts of a 1.5 world, and we are in it now. Anyone who's talking about this notion that we're going to somehow limit warming to 1.5 at this time, I think that they need to look at where we are now and that we are beyond that point. We're beyond limiting to 1.5. We've breached that threshold, and we need to talk about what we can do to build resilience for a 2C world. Because this window that we're in, the window between 1.5C and 2C, has long been held by policymakers and adaptation specialists as the critical window for action. That everything is going to get harder after 2C, And if we want infrastructure that's going to be able to handle 2C+, this is the time. This is the moment for us to act.
Hi, this is Rob. I've gotten a lot of joy, friendship, and insight from hanging out with Jason and Asher here in Crazy Town, even when they're laughing at me instead of with me. I love doing this show, getting the chance to process the insanity of modern techno-industrial society, and coming up with ideas for how we can do something different, like repair ecosystems and make our communities more resilient. If you'd like a chance to interact with the three of us and share some stories and laughs, we've got a special event for you. It's the Crazy Town Hall. Come join us for this live online event on June 23rd, 2026 at 5 p.m. U.S. Pacific Time, 8 p.m. Eastern. It is a fundraiser, so you will need to make a donation to the Post-Carbon Institute to get a ticket to this clown show, town hall. In all seriousness, we love our Crazy Town listeners, and I hope you'll join us at the town hall. To register, please visit resilience.org/crazytownhall. That's resilience.org/crazytownhall. One more time, resilience.org/crazytownhall. See you there.
I actually want to step back and talk about another pattern, another, concern that we're seeing in the oceans right now, which is longer term. It's not something that people are anticipating happening this summer, this year. And that is the AMOC, right? Which some of our viewers and listeners, people certainly who follow you, are probably familiar with. But let's just give people a little bit of context for folks who aren't as familiar. So AMOC stands for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. I'm going to describe my understanding of it, but correct me if I'm wrong. So basically moves warm waters from the very southern part of the Atlantic all the way up to the North Atlantic. And it helps essentially to maintain a mild climate in Western and Northern Europe. And it also helps to regulate the entire global climate system, right? It's a massive force out there. And people have been warning us that it is one of the major tipping points in the climate system that we need to be concerned about. And that's essentially the collapse of that system. That pump of circulating water might collapse.
What you've said is information that is good. I'd like to add another piece of information.
Yes, please.
Which is you're talking about this being like a pump, like a heat pump. I think it's important for our understanding to know what drives that pump, what's making it work. And it's saline gradients. It's that water that is warmer or cooler is going to be associated with the salinity of that water. And so the density of the water, based on how much salt it has in it, is driving the movement of that pump. And AMOC is the best described of these loops, but there are other heat pump systems in Earth's oceans, and those are very fundamental to our climate system. There are many pockets of unusually warm and unusually cool water that were moving through the Gulf Stream in April that we're seeing more and more like high anomaly behavior in the surface temperature of water moving through the Gulf Stream. In the last few months, we've also seen evidence of the Gulf Stream shifting, moving on the north-south axis, which there is paleoclimate evidence that sort of movement precludes current collapse. This is a current where if it hits collapse, if it gets turned from an on to an off position, it's not like game over. This pump is never going to work again. It will eventually, as Earth's climate system changes, turn back on again. And most paleoclimate scientists believe the evidence suggests that it has turned on and off, which is not super comforting as mammals with like an 80-year lifespan.
Right, in our lifespan,
because it's not turning back on in our lifetimes. If it goes down while we're alive, it's not coming back up for us to say hey again. The salt part of this is important because I think many people who care about climate, they're aware that we have a lot of melt coming off of Greenland, more and faster melt than anticipated. And so there's no salt in that water, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do think Donald Trump has a solution for that. I mean, I've heard him talk about turning the
My
taps
gosh.
in Canada to get water down to us. So I think that's why he wants to invade Greenland, right? He just wants to tap that water, keep it from going into the Atlantic and sending it to the AI data centers. I'm thinking, right?
There's some impractical layers to this plan you're laying out.
Really? I thought he figured it all out. I assumed okay, sorry, I interrupted you. Okay.
You're
Yeah.
okay. You're okay.
Yeah.
I mean, like, these problems are so crazy and connected. I know that we have our eyes on Greenland from a couple of perspectives.
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully, the sovereignty of the indigenous people of Greenland stays the predominant perspective in those conversations.
Yeah, that would be
And
nice.
as they're experiencing this rapid melt, it is causing lifeway impact. The ice season is changing. The types of ice that they interact with are changing. If we're getting a bunch of fresh water dumped into the northern side of AMOC, that's exactly what's going to mess up the saline gradients that drive the pump.
Right. Yeah. And so we're talking about a system, you just said, if it turns off, it could turn back on, but we're talking about a time scales very far from what we're just saying with El Nino cycles, and we're talking very long periods of time. But in terms of the risk of AMOC shutting down, what is the time frame that people are thinking about? What's the probability that they're looking at? And how much have people become more and more concerned about that over time, just since you've been kind of studying these things?
When I founded American Resiliency in 2021, the consensus of the climate science community was that we were unlikely to see AMOC collapse before 2100 because we weren't observing signs that would indicate the system was doing anything that weird.
Mm-hmm.
But since 2021, it's doing weird stuff. We're getting observational data coming in where we're like, whoa, what is going on with you, AMOC?
Yeah.
There have been more and more papers started coming out really in 2023 was where there started to be a real glut of AMOC-related evidence papers, not just modeling papers, showing that it is likely that it will collapse by 2025. I'm sorry, by 2050, where we were looking at a range. I know, I did run. We were looking at a range from 2025 then to 2050.
Okay.
Which is a range that is hopefully within our lifetimes. And many sovereign nations are seeing these changes being pointed out by the oceanographic and climate communities, and they want to respond to change. Iceland was the first, to my knowledge, to start to look at this as a sovereignty issue and engage in national level planning for AMOC collapse. The UK Emergency Forum also had a strong AMOC response thread because when we look at projected change impacts based on both modeling and on paleoclimate evidence, we would expect the northern UK to see severe impacts from AMOC collapse.
Like Ice Age kind of territory. What are we talking about here? I mean, if it collapses, these areas are going to become much cooler, I assume, right? Because they're artificially, quote unquote, artificially warmed by the cycles of the circulation of these waters, yeah?
Right. If the Gulf Stream were to stop bringing warm water over to the UK, we would expect sea ice to persist in the winter all the way down to the coast of the northern UK, which is a big change from today. And we would be looking at temperatures in the UK as cold as the temperatures at my house. Eastern Iowa is an excellent climate analog for the winters that would be faced by the UK.
Yeah.
So it's not quite an ice age. I live here, I can report back.
Okay.
No mammoth sightings.
Yeah.
But it is a significant level of cold, and the infrastructure isn't built for it. You know, if you've got a lot of uninsulated pipes, anyone who's Minnesota adjacent is going to be like, oh, hey there, there's a problem.
Right. And it's going to not just impact the UK, right? I mean, we're talking about all over the world on some level.
If we look at the biggest, probable impact points for AMOC collapse, it's Northern Europe, Amazonia, Panama, those are where we see big water cycle changes projected, is off the coast of Panama. And there's a point where there has been a lot of flooding in Brazil, where we would expect a lot of flooding to occur. There are substantial concerns that AMOC collapse will cause very serious instability in the monsoon cycle for Southeast Asia. So we're talking about major ecosystems, Amazon rainforest, looking at negative impacts. We're talking about major food systems and human lifeways in Southeast Asia. And we're talking about very extreme stress on food systems, lifeway, and built environment in large parts of Northern Europe as primary impact sites. Like if you're doing triage, those are the nations that need to get to the front of the line.
And I would just say we're also only talking about the impacts of one particular climate system, environmental system. And you could think about that in the context of a static world, but we're not dealing with static conditions. We were just talking about the fact that if El Nino conditions hit in places like South Asia right now, that's compounding on top of, I mean, this is all man-made or human-made on some level, but, directly, caused by shortages of things as a result of the war in Iran, right? So like to assume that everything else will be hunky-dory and stable if an AMOC system collapses is probably not accurate either, So we're looking at lots of instability.
Yeah, we haven't shown good global behavior. We haven't shown a good ability to respond to change together. I'd like to take a second, if it's okay with you, and kind of look back at El Nino and AMOC and this fear of the Super El Nino, right?
Okay, yeah.
If we're concerned about a Super El Nino that's going to last a long time, I think it's worth noting that that is going to drive freshwater melt in the north, right? Off of Greenland, and probably push AMOC shutdown forward. It is worth noting that as we kind of have this push-pull where the AMOC system is getting a little wobbly, right? That drives a cold trend in the northern hemisphere. I think that a probable outcome in our basket of uncertainty is that we'll be looking at an overall very warm winter this winter, the 26-27 winter, because of the high probability of this El Nino, but that it could directly push us towards a cold winter next winter because of this contribution to AMOC instability. And for anyone who loves living things, that sort of whiplash pattern where you get unusual heat and then unusual cold the following year, that's very challenging. That's a big resilience challenge on the ground to see what can handle both conditions. And my inclination is not to look straight at probability of a multi-year Super El Nino, but to maintain an all hazards approach and accept this probability that the El Nino could drive a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, more AMOC down type winter behavior, which is going to be cold from a northern hemisphere perspective.
Yeah, I think you're getting to one of the huge challenges, I think, psychologically and practically, which is we're dealing with complex adaptive systems here, and they interact with one another, and there are many variables that lead, to change. And so trying to predict within those systems is really difficult. But even just thinking about, I'll use myself as an example, trying to make decisions as a person based upon trying to understand what's happening and anticipating what might come, right? So I moved to Oregon from Northern California. We went through severe drought, a couple cycles of very, very severe drought when we were living in California. And I was really concerned about water shortages, fire risks. I had a son with asthma, and we were looking at where might we move if this area is going to become, very dry, and people talked about sort of a perpetual drought there. Well, we've actually seen, right. And I will say, and I didn't predict this, but just months after we left, a fire did tear through, the Tubbs fire tore through Santa Rosa where we were living just months months before. But in the years since, what we've actually seen are unprecedented, snowfalls in the Sierra. They've seen actually more extremes, including more precipitation than the normal some years. And so it's like, I wouldn't have predicted that, right? I thought the future is just going to be dry in this part of the world. And instead, what we're seeing is lots of oscillation. And that makes it just really, really hard to know how to prepare. So maybe you talk about that, both the difficulty in having certainty or predicting what the future is going to look like, and how you think about building resilience in the context of all those different possible scenarios.
It is psychologically difficult, very psychologically difficult. I think that what we've taken for granted for so long in Earth's climate systems is what is normal. We think about like a typical summer day or a typical May day in our minds, and we can picture that. But in the projections, we're looking at a future that's like all edges. It's less middle, more edges. If you can think about an unusually cold day that you experienced in your memory in the summer, as well as the heat wave day, as well as the day that all of a sudden it started hailing for some reason.
Yeah.
It's all those wild cards, all those edges are what is going to become our new normal. And that's why I think an all hazards approach is really important. In parts of California, Southern California especially, there is a conserved cross-model drought trend. However, there's also a prediction, and very fascinatingly, I sent you this research link. There's modeling-based evidence that atmospheric rivers will increase both in a standard warming pathway and an AMOC collapse pathway.
Yeah.
So even though you're dealing with this drought trend, you could get totally hosed by atmospheric rivers every 2 or 3 years, right? Drought trend, landscape change due to aridity, plus giant volume of water dumped on you irregularly. And that is just not something we have the cultural knowledge to hold. When we think about this future where a drought deluge trend, an absence of your gentle rains, your gentle sustaining rains, is sort of the way it looks like it's heading everywhere, I think that the most resilient response I can think of is that we have to prepare to be that middle. We have to create what normalcy, what averages we would like to create at a landscape level, where if water is coming in a drought deluge pattern, thinking about water storage and water distribution is how we create that middle, how we create that normal.
Yeah. I mean, it is a challenge when you think about food production, though, right? Because you talked about aridity and then just deluge of water. And it's great to store that water if you can for those periods where things are dry. But, crops fail when they get absolutely pummeled by heavy precipitation as well. It's a real challenge to think about how you steal for those kinds of conditions.
An area that I think is very promising is perennial crops. Perennial Promise is the name of one of the organizations that I admire in that space.
Yeah.
When you talk about deluge-driven crop failure, a lot of that time is when the plants are hit by deluge at a critical life stage.
Yeah.
A seedling life stage, for example, is going to get totally washed out in a deluge. If you're dealing with perennial crops, and there are very interesting things being done in perennial grain crops, oil crops, and protein crops, you can be talking about a plant that is on a much longer timeline, say a 5-year timeline, where your periods of vulnerability are going to be much smaller to any particular weather event.
In our office, we have a great photo of Wes Jackson, who's a friend of Post-Carbon Institute, used to be a fellow of ours, with a photo of one of his colleagues actually holding kernza, which is this perennial grain that they've been, creating.
The first perennial kernza that I had heard of being planted in Iowa was from a female land worker at La Jolla Farms. And it just looks like grass. It doesn't look like it's the future, but you can look over this field that could be crabgrass if you didn't know what was going on. And it's like that does look tough. That grain does
Right.
look tough.
Yeah.
And the farm is successfully producing it as a market crop. You can buy it on their online store.
Cool. Well, is there any other weirdness that's happening in our oceans that we need to be aware of that, because we haven't scared people enough? Is there anything else that you just want to flag before we talk a little bit about what resiliency looks like in the face of this?
When we think about the ocean, I think that it's very important for our understanding of climate to know that the ocean is holding more heat than the land. The
Hmm.
ocean has absorbed more heat. I think that it is reasonable to say that the ocean is pissed off. Like, we've done enough to the ocean at this time. When we think about climate change, most of us, of course, think about land based impacts because we do
Sure.
not live in the ocean.
Yeah.
But when we think about ocean impacts and ocean ecosystems, many people are not aware of how close to the brink we are in many ocean ecosystems. That ocean acidification is impacting reproduction in ocean ecosystems today. It's a today problem.
Hmm.
And so, if you're a person who's trying to build resilience on the coast, you should not assume that you're going to be interacting with the same ocean 20 years from now that your community may have for centuries. You shouldn't assume that the ocean is going to yield the same foods and other goods that you might use from the ocean. You should assume that your relationship with the ocean is going to change. I
Hmm.
think that for all of us, knowing that ocean based change is going to continue to be the leading change edge is critical for our understanding. I hope that that is a helpful big concept for people.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's not even talking about the impacts of plastics or other things that we're doing, overfishing, all the other things that we're doing to the oceans right now. So talk a little bit about resilience, and maybe specifically, if you have any thoughts about this, as it relates to some of these patterns or possibilities that we've been talking about, with El Nino, Super El Nino, AMOC collapse. How should people who are listening or watching this be thinking about building resilience in that context?
Strongly recommend thinking about action rather than seeking out information in a compulsive loop. Because if you wanted to read articles about the possibility of a super El Nino, you could definitely do that forever in our current age of slopification. When we look at the likely impacts of this El Nino for the second half of this year, we're talking 2C today. We're talking that this could be our 2C August. It
Mm,
wouldn't be completely beyond belief if we hit global surface averages, at least temporarily, at the 2C marker. I'm not saying year on year starting this year. I'm not saying monthly average. We could hit it for days, for weeks at
mhm,
this El Nino peak. We know what the high end heat projections are, what the hot season increase projections are for 2C here in the US. And there's resources at American Resiliency where everyone can review those projections for themselves at the county level. Having a plan to deal with projected heat of that intensity, possibly in the context of utility instability,
mhm,
would be an action-based way to respond to this reality at the household and community level. If you know that there's a possibility you're going to be dealing with a week of additional temps over 105, you should have a plan for where in your house you could go to stay cool. Or if you live in an apartment where there's no underground space, there's no sun-sheltered space, you should know what location you would want to go to and what you would bring. If you're in an area where you're concerned about instability in the power grid, which NERC declared a level 3 warning that we're looking at power grid instability and they're working on patching the problem. Their
mhm,
declaration of that alert is not like a freak out. It's like, oh, good, they're doing their job. They're trying to stop this from happening, right?
mhm,
But if we're dealing with potential for grid instability, having a plan for backup power is a good idea. And your plan can be dumb. Your plan doesn't have to totally solve the problem.
mhm,
You can have a plan that is better than having no plan at all, and that'll help your family. Don't let the fact that you can't store a month's worth of water stop you from storing 3 days worth of water.
mhm,
Don't let the fact that you don't want to or can't afford to buy a generator stop you from buying some of those space blankets that cost $150, which you can tape in your windows to reflect the light and heat back out to help your home stay cool. I am a big proponent of janky solutions versus no solutions. And I think that kind of mindset where you're like, how can I work this problem with what I have? It doesn't need to go on Instagram. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I have some semblance of a plan before the power goes off and it's 112 degrees outside. Because you're not going to think so good then, you know? You're going to have to rely on your past self. It is known that human beings get more stupid and more irritable when we're hot. So when we're talking about heat-related
I
emergencies,
guess I'm hot all the time. God, I didn't realize.
it's a scale, right? It's a spectrum. I mean, I'm just telling you about how I love janky plans. Like,
Yeah,
playing this smart is not the only way to play it, you know?
that's good. You're setting the bar right where I live.
Who amongst us is not overwhelmed and really in a place where it's very hard to focus on the good for the perfect because of the images and the content we're fed all the time? It's okay for us to do the best we can to solve a problem rather than continue to critique what efforts we can make in the right direction.
Yeah, I deal with this every weekend when I'm at the farm trying to weed and realizing that, like, I'm letting the perfect be the enemy of the good here, trying to get every last little weed out. You can't do that all the time. What about longer term for folks? So I think you gave some concrete, examples of preparing at least a little bit for heat and maybe, disruption to electricity systems. But longer term, what would you say to people if we're looking at an ongoing likelihood of greater instability, greater fluctuations, more extremes living at the edges, like you said? What do you tell people to do if they're taking a more of a medium term, perspective in terms of their time frame?
I think we need to prioritize protection of soil and water where we are. And that can be done through civic involvement at many levels. And we need to prioritize local food systems where we are. Wherever you live, there's probably community supported agriculture. Buying a share in a CSA is a practical investment towards your future, and it's going to make you cook weird food. That's an important part of
Kernza,
learning
maybe.
to live within a local food system. When I first got a CSA box, I was living in Arizona. I first started doing CSAs when I was a graduate student.
Hmm.
And for 2 months, all I got were wheat berries and green chilies. And I was like,
What am I going to do with
I
this?
don't know how to handle this. I'm from Chicago, but I was a poor grad student. So that was what I ate, right? It
Yeah.
was wheat berry and chili based food for 2 months.
Yeah, you're going to have to share your recipes.
I don't know if they're worth it. We're talking about making a go of it,
Yeah.
not making like a beautiful quiche of it. But when we connect with the local food system and we start to eat differently, we start to learn what the patterns are where we live, what can be produced where we live, contributing to that financially matters. You don't have to grow all your own food. And as someone who grows a reasonable percentage of her family's own food, I grow a lot of our own fresh produce. My desire to have to grow our own staple calories is zero because I wouldn't be able to do anything else. We need to support farmers in our community so that they can be the local food system we need. In my area, we're very fortunate. There are many small to mid-sized dairy and beef operations. And dairy farmers across America have had a terrible epidemic of suicide. Their working conditions are very hard. Many of them, they operate on super tight margins or losses. There's no next generation. It's a labor of love. It's the persistence and the resilience of those small and mid-sized operations that is allowing our local food system to scale up in a big way over the last couple of years. As people from across political and information spectrums start thinking about these supply chain issues, and they want to know what local food they can get.
Yeah, I think you're right. Growing, if you can, or learning how to grow is valuable, and there are lots of ways that people can do that. Supporting local farmers is another way to do it, for sure. I also think acting politically, I mean, you talked about soil and water, and a lot of communities are now dealing with, and we're talking about electricity, they're dealing with a lot of instability and issues as a result of like data centers coming into their communities in some places that frankly don't make a lot of sense from a water perspective. So I think it's hard because we can all feel scattered trying to engage in all these different levels. But I think the point here is that there's lots of need for people to step forward and be active on some level. So that could be growing your own food. It could be supporting local farmers. It could be acting politically, to support your community.
When we talk about acting politically on water, like with data center opposition, this area where I've worked to share out resources through AR, because coming together on the ground matters for our resilience. We need to be able to work together for our communities. And people from across the ideological spectrum are often able to come together in unexpected and powerful ways on water. I think that thinking about this as community action, thinking about it as standing up in the interests of your community together, we could work towards the kind of unity that we need on the ground to advocate for our interests in a time of change. Because all of us in our communities do have shared interests in being able to drink and being able to eat. And when we're able to break bread together, when we're able to have these deep connections together, it can unlock more problem-solving capability. Because we're dealing with problems that are so big, we need everyone at the table. And so finding ways to build that community now is more important than ever.
And there's lots of evidence, for people who are concerned about polarization that's happening. There's lots of evidence that actually working collectively with people who are different than you on projects, not just having conversations to learn from each other and understand each other, which is also valuable, but actually working together on projects is in some ways the best way to overcome polarization in communities. So I think that makes a ton of sense for so many reasons to be focused on working collaboratively with others in our communities. So I want to thank you, Emily, for taking the time to kind of update listeners on what's happening out there. I encourage folks to check out American Resiliency, both the website, but also your YouTube channel. And I'll keep tuning in myself to just get updates as these systems keep changing and we have more of a sense of what's actually happening out there, including what's happening with the prospects of an El Nino this year. So thank you.
I'm always excited to talk with you. And I will be keeping the El Nino coverage going on AR. We're going to have coverage when El Nino is declared, and we're going to continue to watch what's happening, not just with sea surface temperatures, but with other Earth systems, especially other Earth-ocean systems, because we're looking at uncertainty. But even as we accept that, I think we want to know what we can know in this time of change, right?
Totally.
So we'll keep looking forward and we'll keep looking for what edges do you want to try and hold. As we look towards El Nino summer, I think that if you want to get ready for August, September and look at hot season projections at 2C, you've got yourself a path towards practical action that could be really useful at the household and community level.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and you want others to consider these issues, then please share Crazy Town with your friends. Hit that share button in your podcast app or just tell them face to face. Maybe you can start some much needed conversations and do some things together to get us out of Crazy Town. Thanks again for listening and sharing.
Crazy Town. Crazy Town.